If I could just comment one thing. I think that the crisis itself is much more of an opportunity. This is just in general, a general outlook on sustainable development. I think that if things were going well, we would have kept doing them the same way that we've always been doing. I mean, that's just how we work, right? And I think the crisis has basically told us we need to change, things need to change, we need to look at things differently, we need to redefine what our success is, we need to look at the value created in a completely different way. We need to talk about the quality of life that people who are living in these areas, and these have very feasible, it's not immaterial, just as Shalini was saying, the whole concept of health gains, and just general quality of life. And I think companies have started to understand that and have been accepting it as a form of return. And I think from a public policy perspective, there's so much investment that is going from the state into infrastructure and from the city into infrastructure. And we are the ones who have to be worried in many ways about the long term as well. I mean, we are talking about paying a little more for a rubber asphalt, just a little more for that. And in 5-6 years, that cost already paid for itself because you're not having to rebuild it. The cars are much better. The rate of accidents is much. So I think we've come to a change in mindset in which people are understanding that these intangible benefits from these investments are part, and that can be a part of our bottom line. We can accept that. And the other side of it is we are looking at being much better at evaluating and giving a monetary value to the benefits we have from it. Now we can put a dollar sign, and people like dollar signs or hell signs. It can be either one of them. And we've come to a very good point where these things are becoming a reality. And I really do think it's mostly because of the crisis. Otherwise, people would have just going with business as usual.
I think I would just add a point following on. It's always good for a local official to hear a federal official talking about flexibility. That always makes us happy. So in the spirit of that, I will concede from the city perspective that one of the only reasons that this investment is occurring is because it's mandated at the federal level. And so there's a very important role for the federal government to play. The city would not be in all likelihood spending $2 billion over 20 years to really change the way that we manage our stormwater if we didn't have regulatory measures that we had to comply with. And likewise, Rio wouldn't be spending the billions of dollars it's spending if it didn't have to prepare for the Olympics. And so when you have these mandates, whether they come, whether they're self-imposed and sort of saying, we want to host a major event, or whether they come from the outside, you have to look to those opportunities and say, okay, let's make sure that we're investing those dollars in a way that has important sustainable impacts. I think it's also important from a government, I'll say a large institution perspective. So whether you're a government, a major corporation, a major university, a major nonprofit, your procurement standards can really drive sustainability. And we've seen this in the United States. The Government Services Administration, who's in charge of running all federal government buildings, has set LEED standards for their buildings. And that's even driven regional markets like Philadelphia, where we have many different federal agencies have their regional headquarters in Philadelphia. The building owners in Philadelphia know that their buildings have to meet certain environmental standards when they get upgraded if they want to compete for the government's business. So those happen. The same is true when major corporations do that. And last but not least, this is in some ways the greatest challenge, is developing the investment mechanisms that really motivate investing in sustainability and guarantee that some of those paybacks come. So we've seen in our the state that we're from, Pennsylvania, that we have something called the Guaranteed Energy Savings Act, which has emboldened very conservative municipalities who would normally, their fiscal advisors would say, well, we can't be sure that the energy savings, will pay for this, so let's just do the least expensive thing. Well, the Guaranteed Energy Savings Act says you can contract with companies, and those companies have to guarantee those savings. If they don't occur, they have to pay you the difference. Well, we've seen energy savings projects occur and been proven and then go on after that because we have a policy framework and some investment mechanisms that allow it to happen.
Eu gostaria de acrescentar, eu acho que tem que haver um entendimento das autoridades. Não existe desenvolvimento sustentável, existe desenvolvimento que não pode existir se não for sustentável. A gente começa a olhar essas cifras astronômicas. O BID recentemente divulgou que a América Latina vai ter que gastar 100 bilhões de dólares por ano se não fizer nada em relação às mudanças climáticas. Os números começam a se perder de vista e a gente perde a noção das dimensões. Eu acho que o mundo hoje percebeu já essa necessidade e começa a fazer o exercício, como o Walter comentou, de tentar precificar, fazer essas comparações de forma adequada. O desafio da sustentabilidade é um desafio um pouco de governança, né? Como fazer o gestor do hospital entender que o investimento em árvores da região é importante na gestão dele, né? A gente ainda tende a pensar as coisas dentro da caixinha. O entendimento do planejamento estratégico, da visão estratégica de forma transversal e holística, ainda é um desafio para os administradores, né? Enfrenta as burocracias. Mas eu acho que a gente tem avançado bastante. A gente acabou de finalizar um estudo, por exemplo, nessa tentativa de valorar os ativos ambientais, numa estimativa, quando trabalhamos com o i3, que é um software utilizado para calcular o carbono estocado nas árvores, descobrimos que tem 12 milhões e meio de toneladas de carbono estocado nas árvores da cidade, né? Isso a preço de mercado, se a gente considerar aí, o Walter entende mais de mercado de carbono do que eu, mas 5 dólares a tonelada, você pode valer 60 milhões. Há uma estimativa dos serviços ambientais, dos serviços sociais que a cobertura vegetal da cidade provê à cidade, de 250 milhões de dólares, quer dizer, 5, 6 vezes mais do que o valor de mercado. O mercado não está precificando corretamente os serviços que esses ativos ambientais nos provêm. A regulação, a gente tem encontrado dificuldade no âmbito federal, né? Se não tiver o governo federal demandando, criando um sistema de cap and trade, que a gente, enfim, luta tanto nos bastidores para que saia, mas fica difícil, talvez, uma cidade numa escala menor, ou de repente uma região, ter uma dimensão suficiente para interferir no mercado. Mas eu acho que as cidades, elas têm tomado iniciativas aonde nos instrumentos que são mais de domínio próprio. Eu destacaria, concordo com o que o Andrew disse em termos de compras públicas, né? A Prefeitura do Rio tem, por exemplo, 118 mil funcionários, né? É um empregador gigantesco, tem um orçamento de 17, 18 bilhões de reais por ano. Quer dizer, esse peso é capaz de mexer, de fomentar a economia verde que a gente tanto quer. Então eu acho que essas iniciativas que a gente tem implementado devem servir de exemplo aí. Eu sei que os tomadores de decisão em nível global e multilateral encontram outras dificuldades, não vamos entrar muito nesse detalhe, mas eu acho que as cidades têm instrumentos efetivos para promover o crescimento verde.
Wondering if we can stay with the Rio theme for a moment. And Walter, you previously mentioned the Green Environmental Access Exchange, and I know that Rio has gotten some positive press out of the Rio Operations Center that you launched recently. And so thinking about services, not only environmental services, but the services that you provide to your citizens in Rio, just wondering if both of you can talk a little bit more about those two initiatives and how you think those are impacting the way that people in Rio, both private sector and your residents, how they are thinking about sustainability.
So let me start talking about the Green Environmental Asset Exchange. This was an initiative that started about a year ago, and it is a partnership between the state of Rio and the city of Rio through the Secretary of Finance and the private sector, which is a way of saying, if public policy is at the heart of the change to the green economy, and I think everyone on this table just clearly mentioned that public policy is the key driver that is going to flick the switch, whether for the private sector or for the consumer or for the population itself. How can we create new tools that will allow us to go beyond traditional command and control strategies to deal with environmental issues? And I think, speaking for Rio, and I think I can speak for a lot of Brazil, environmentally speaking, policy has been mostly command and control. It's change these filters, shut this off, let me get this out of my land, or put something over there. And our interest was basically on saying, let's get the financial sector into this. Let's bring the financial sector, let's create these environmental assets. Let's stop treating nature and environmental assets as if they were intangible. Let's give them some tangibility. And let's let the financial sector understand and start to factor it into their decision-making process. So it started with looking at what kind of assets we could talk about. And the first one and the most obvious one is the carbon. So we started looking at how we can set up a carbon market here in the state of Rio. And a lot of people that are here have been working with us on this topic and know a little bit of our struggle to get this off the ground. And creating targets for the industry is the first step on giving a price to carbon and giving a market-based structure based on allowances and credits. Just lets the financial sector and the companies decide what is the best way for them to go about it. And that's just one example of environmental assets that can be created, and possibly the most obvious one of them. We can also talk about, how do you translate área de proteção permanente, APP? You can talk about the areas in every farm in Brazil that need to have a permanent protection area. Some land in your farm needs to be forested. You need to have native coverage on it. So if you have an overflow, if you have more than what your target requires, you can transform that into an asset and you can sell that to someone else that has the obligation within either the same state or the same biome. And this is just an example. We've talking about water as an environmental asset that could be transacted. We've been talking about waste itself. In Brazil, there's a reverse logistics law that establishes that companies are responsible for the final destination of the products. So instead of just you having to do it yourself, why not allow someone who can give that a destination, whether it is, let's get these tires and turn it into asphalt, to get a credit that says, I managed to give a proper sustainable ending to this waste. And companies like Michelin and Pirelli, they just can buy it instead of having to worry about that. And besides that, there's a lot that comes from it. And I think it's been mentioned that, once you create an environmental asset program, once you have companies thinking about this, you will find green finance coming to your city and coming to your state, and you will start having consultants who are thinking about these things, and you have lawyers. I don't know if having lawyers is ever a good thing, but you can have green lawyers who are trying to help companies reach their targets, and you will foment new technologies, and it's a bit of a snowball effect that it starts with just how can we have a better public policy tool, how we can attract the financial sector to these opportunities, and you end up really putting the green economy into practice.
Eu gostaria de destacar um pouco nessa linha eu acho que a gente tem que aproveitar um avanço legislativo importante, que foi a criação da legislação de parcerias público-privadas. Elas ainda são muito incipientes, né? No plano federal, principalmente. De novo, eu diria que no aspecto federal há um pouco menos de iniciativa do que no âmbito municipal e estadual para esse tipo de articulação com o setor privado. Eu destacaria alguns exemplos assim cotidianos nossos. Eu gosto muito de falar do Bike Rio, que é um programa de aluguel de bicicletas, né? Foi inspirado muito em Paris, né? Que já implementou há algum tempo. E ali a gente observou uma parceria público-privada que começou a diferença entre o sucesso e o fracasso, né? Quando o programa foi iniciado, não pela falta de expertise dos operadores, até porque havia um empenho e um compromisso para enfim, melhorar o serviço, mas faltava escala, né? E faltava um certo comprometimento da população, um engajamento da população. Como é que você, vamos dizer assim, consegue isso, né? Esse intangível? A discussão, a remodelagem do projeto, ampliando o número de estações. Hoje a gente tem mais de 55 estações, que são 500 mil viagens, 550 bicicletas. A gente saiu de 12, 13 estações para 55 estações de bicicleta. O fato de ter dado escala ao projeto e ter trazido um parceiro privado para a modelagem do sistema permitiu que o sistema fosse um sucesso, né? A última coisa que se queria é aquela coisa do poder público bancando um negócio que não vai ter futuro, né? A gente precisa da sustentabilidade econômica, sustentabilidade. E o projeto é tão exitoso que até mesmo Nova York, que também está implementando um projeto de aluguel de bicicletas, agora olhou um pouco essa modelagem. Me parece que até o Citibank que vai apoiar no caso de Nova York. Quer dizer, eu acho que a experiência de estar trocando, né, essas histórias e apresentando onde está o certo, onde está o errado, e trazendo, agregando setor privado, sociedade civil, é o caminho para a gente dar materialidade a essa discussão de desenvolvimento sustentável.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I think we should open it up now to questions from the audience. So if you have a question, if you could raise your hand. There are people coming around with microphones.
Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? I was interested that you're...
Sorry, could you please introduce yourself first?
Sorry.
Thank you.
I'm Jean Kwan. I'm the mayor of Oakland. I am the chair of the Local Government Commission, which is a smart growth association in California. And I was the chair of the StopWaste.org, which is one of the premier waste management consortiums of governments in the San Francisco, Oakland Bay area. So we have been looking at no capital projects, so where we don't put the money out. So for instance, right now, Oakland and San Jose are looking at converting all of our street lights to LED lights, and that we think that the energy savings will pay for itself. We may have to do some bonding on it, but what we see is that we could develop, if we could get the capital up front, that will eventually pay for itself, and then we can lend that money again to other cities in the region. And so we're trying to pull together a pool of a few $1 million in the Bay Area, and so that it will eventually be self-sustaining. And there are some companies that think they can actually do it just based on the savings. So for instance, Sungevity, which is the law, because the cost of solar chips is so inexpensive now, they basically are selling solar systems to homeowners in Oakland, and the cost of savings of electricity pays for the system. And so those are the two things that I think when governments are really stretched that we're looking at, things that our homeowners can do themselves, and they can sell that energy back to the grid. And then even with our own municipal facilities, trying to bond it in a way that we don't have to put any capital out. So I'm wondering, since we're looking for $30 billion or $70 billion, whether or not there can't be some of that money that be a revolving pool that would then be more attractive for some of the first world nations to put the money in, because it could be a one-time commitment on a revolving pool.
Yeah, I would just add one comment to that, and it connects to something Walter was talking about. And part of it is getting the markets right. So one of the challenges that we have on the East Coast, and a little bit of contrast to California, is that our cost of power at night when streetlights are on is so low, it's very hard to make the math work for it. At the same time, it's coal-fired power plants that run all the time that are providing that cheap power throughout the night. And so if we got the costs right and the carbon costs built in, that very well could change the equation.
For the state of Rio as well, we've been looking into how we can help solve those solutions. I think ESCOs, which are the energy saving companies, have been approached. We have been talking to them to see how we can do that into larger scale throughout all the state of Rio. We were even talking for a while about USCOs. We were talking about utility savings company, and I was going to say something very similar to that, because we wanted to do that with water. but water is so cheap. It is so cheap that there's no interest in making it more efficient. So a lot of it is really getting the price right and getting our price ready. And besides that, we've been looking at some financial modeling to see if we can also do the same, how we can raise this money up front so we can make these large-scale investments. And we've been talking, I think Shalini and I, we've talked about this briefly as well, about creating green bonds, about creating this new type of finance that is going to attract a different type of investor, a long-term investor, who's going to work with these USCOs in order to have these project deliveries. And it's our big challenge right now. But I think we're getting there. And part of it is having the right financial mechanisms, whether it be a bond, whether it be a utility saving company. Brazil has advanced a lot. We can do the distributed energy generation. Until last month, we couldn't put solar panels in our house, and the energy we could only use it ourselves. We couldn't sell it back to the grid, and now we can do that, which is a huge step for us. And part of it is getting the pricing. Yeah. Carbon pricing is at the heart of this, and if you don't do that, I don't know what we can do. I don't see a good solution.
Well, I think there are two parts of this that are really important, and I think, Mayor Kwan, you're right. Cities should not ignore opportunities to do low cost of capital investments like this, where you identify savings that can create create the churn you need for investment. It's a very different thing for small cities than medium-sized cities than large cities. What Andrew was describing is a genuine problem for replicating this approach. But I think what we've seen at the federal level, the revolving model that you describe, is an incredibly important model for EPA in financing water. And we have state revolving loan funds for investment in drinking water and clean water systems. But I think there. I'm going to. Yeah, and I'm going to.
I'm sorry, maybe I didn't describe it clearly. But we see it as a regional model. Oakland, San Francisco, San Jose will lead. And as we create the funding and the pool and return the money to the pool, we can almost lend it for no cost to the smaller cities as an advantage for the whole region, because you get the costs down and because of the big numbers, and then you can lend the money to the smaller cities.
And that is exactly the kind of model we are trying to capture and highlight and transfer through the JIUS. So I applaud you for that, and I think it's incredibly important. What we see differently in the federal funding discussions, the national and international discussions, is it's not a problem of creating big buckets of money. It's a problem of creating the types of project models that can attract that investment and recirculate it. And that's exactly what you've done. The problem with leading an initiative called the JIUS is that everything that comes back to you is a food analogy. So if you'll indulge me for a moment, one of the things we hear most from the private sector is that putting money into giant buckets doesn't help it get spent better. And we had one of our key investors, a large investment banker, and I'll leave them unnamed, who described this as kind of the minestrone soup model of financing, where governments at every level have no idea what color of money comes from the private sector, and they throw it all into one pot, and you have, peas and carrots and macaroni all floating around in the soup. And that makes each of them very uncomfortable. You have no idea what you're going to get in each bite. And it's a real problem for private investors who need to be able to track dollars down, and for governments who don't necessarily have the same color of money. The analogy we got back as the appropriate approach was, how do you create a layered model of finance where you can put down a layer of public funding, be able to attract low cost of capital private funding, and bring in long-term investors, equity, debt for cities in models, whether they're revolving or not, that create the kinds of value that we're talking about for cities. This is a lot more of a lasagna finance model than a minestrone soup model. And it's really, really important, because I think our international discussions, which just focus on building a bucket to put money into, ignore the key problem, which is that we aren't developing projects at scale that can attract big money that's already out there. That there's already there's interest in putting money into sustainable investment. And that's the challenge that we're trying to solve through the JIUS, is building the kinds of project pipelines and portfolios that attract that investment. And I think you've hit on a great example. It's exactly what regions need to do, where cities themselves are too small to do the kind of investment in lighting, in energy efficiency or water efficiency that you're describing.
Great, thank you. We had another question here.
Boa tarde. Meu nome é Roberto Anderson Magalhães. Eu queria fazer uma pergunta ao representante do governo do Estado. Antes da pergunta, uma sugestão. Uma sugestão e uma pergunta. Em relação à sugestão, nós temos no Estado do Rio, a Companhia de Águas do Rio tem mananciais históricos que são tombados pelo patrimônio e estão se deteriorando. Seria muito importante se eles efetivamente fossem recuperados, porque não só pela questão histórica, mas pela questão do manancial em si de água. São fontes de águas que estão se deteriorando, por exemplo, a fonte do Rio Carioca em Santa Teresa. Mas como pergunta, eu lhe traria a seguinte questão. Você colocou que há um interesse do governo do Estado em modificar a linha de desenvolvimento em direção a uma nova economia. Mas até onde eu sei, este governo que aí está, que já foi reeleito, foi responsável por uma série quer dizer, se diz que o Rio de Janeiro está num renascimento econômico, mas esse renascimento é baseado no petróleo, na siderúrgica. A última siderúrgica feita em Sepetiba criou um enorme problema ambiental para todos os moradores vizinhos, na petroquímica, com o Comperj, que está em plena fase de construção, e na indústria automobilística no interior do Estado. Quer dizer, eu queria entender, em termos quantitativos, o que significa essa real mudança de paradigmas, de interesse num novo desenvolvimento para o Estado do Rio, porque o que se vê em termos reais é ainda a antiga economia dominando e o governo dando toda a força para essa antiga economia.
Para você ver como o meu trabalho não é fácil, né? Para você ver como o nosso desafio é realmente grande. O nosso desafio, além disso, é como é que a gente consegue utilizar essa base e a renda e o dinheiro que vem desse modelo atual para construir um modelo novo. Eu acho que existe um momento muito forte já por trás de uma série de investimentos. O que você falou é verdade, e virão outras empresas mais pesadas, a gente vai ter mais siderurgias aparecendo no Estado, que é a visão tradicional do tipo de empresa que tradicionalmente vem para o Rio de Janeiro. Existe uma vontade de mudar, existe uma vontade de atrair empresas diferentes do Estado. O nosso grande desafio é esse, a gente criar esses polos de desenvolvimento verde que vão atrair empresas que estão falando de placas solares, de turbinas eólicas, empresas que também de grande porte, empresas que dão emprego, empresas que vão trazer renda para o Estado, mas que têm esse pensamento diferente. É um projeto de longo prazo. Eu acho que no Brasil a gente não tem esses pipelines de investimento tão forte assim. O Brasil tradicionalmente não recebe empresas dessa natureza, então é um esforço até nacional, e o Rio de Janeiro tem todo o interesse de sair na frente disso. O Estado começou agora um projeto chamado Rio Capital da Energia, que é exatamente uma tentativa de trazer esse outro tipo de empresa. Mas ao mesmo tempo a gente não pode negar que a gente tem no Rio de Janeiro uma riqueza natural chamada petróleo, que tem que ser utilizada para a criação dessa nova economia, para alavancar essa questão da economia verde. Não é fácil, é uma mudança de mentalidade muito grande que tem que acontecer dentro do governo, dentro do setor privado, dentro dos nossos parceiros, sejam prefeituras ao redor do Rio de Janeiro, para a gente alcançar isso. É o desafio, é o grande desafio do Rio de Janeiro, é o grande desafio do mundo. Então eu acho que a gente está realmente nesse momento de transição e é um processo. É um processo que começou agora, é um processo que eu tenho certeza que vai se intensificar nos próximos anos. E se você me perguntar daqui a 4 anos isso de novo, eu espero ter números muito maiores para te mostrar.
So we'll take one final quick question in the last 3 minutes that we have. And I apologize that we can't get to all of them, but I'm sure the panelists would be happy to stay afterwards and answer your questions.
David Zia, Universidade do Estado do Rio de Janeiro. Eu vejo essa questão da sustentabilidade como se fosse um personagem onde a cabeça é o primeiro setor, que é o governo. As mãos, o segundo setor, que é a classe empresarial, as empresas privadas. E as pernas, a sociedade. Então a pergunta dele, né, tem uma visão política, a cabeça, tem os empresários que fazem, mas não tem sustentabilidade, eventualmente, com a participação da sociedade. Então, frente ao que eu aprendi com o JIUS, que eu achei uma experiência muito boa, eu queria propor aqui e ver o que os senhores acham. Na verdade, a gente teria que continuar fomentando essa conversa entre os três setores, de tal forma que a gente chegue numa congruência. A importância do JIUS é exatamente tentar essa congruência, porque tem o segundo setor que eventualmente vai investir, que no caso os empresários, o governo vai dar o respaldo legal, né? E a sociedade efetivamente vai referendar, digamos assim. Então, uma sugestão como instrumento para fomentar e desenvolver essas parcerias, essas conversas, seria uma espécie de uma câmara de oportunidades para a sustentabilidade urbana. Assim como os moldes da Câmara de Comércio Brasil-Estados Unidos, poderia haver uma câmara de oportunidades de sustentabilidade ambiental, uma na Filadélfia e outra aqui no Rio de Janeiro, onde a gente pudesse congregar os diversos setores da sociedade para participar no sentido de haver o encontro de uma congruência, tanto do investimento, quanto da questão política e também da vontade social. A pergunta é, o que vocês acham dessa sugestão, ou se tem algum outro instrumento que talvez...
Eu acho ótimo. Eu só não gostei muito da solução do governo sem a cabeça, eu acho que... Não, mas estou brincando. Mas eu acho que tem a cabeça dessa, todos nós temos que fazer parte dessa cabeça. É uma decisão. Cada vez mais o mundo vive uma decisão coletiva, né? Esse espaço aqui é interessante, um pouco, acho que tem visualmente a distribuição, ela traz um pouco esse sentimento, né? A experiência da Rio+20 é um dos valores maiores dela, justamente essa decisão compartilhada, né? Mas eu concordo, seria ótimo estar frequentando Filadélfia sempre com o meu cheesesteak, que a gente teve, mas eu acho importante, a deputada Aspásia está aqui, né, está preparando o nosso centro lá, né, Aspásia, vai ser um dos legados da Rio+20, acho que pode ser um dos hubs dessa Câmara que você está se referindo.
And Rodrigo can stay right here, and I will bring the cheesesteak to him on our new sustainability joint venture. In all seriousness, though, there is in Philadelphia something called the Sustainable Business Network, which has literally hundreds of small businesses throughout the region that have as a core value sustainability, who have gotten together, who fund what I guess could be called a small secretariat that helps bring them together around issues of sustainability, and have become very much a driving force in small and medium-sized businesses for sustainable procurement, for promoting policies that are sustainable in government, and also for holding government accountable to small and medium-sized businesses in the implementation of their policy. And so they've partnered a great deal with the Water Department on making sure that the programs that they're developing are work for small and medium-sized businesses. And I think seeing that kind of model grow into much more of a movement with very much real results would be a great thing. And I fully support more Rio-Philadelphia partnerships.
I think, David, it's an incredibly creative suggestion, and I think this is what I've loved about the last year of working on the JIUS with all of you, is that these ideas come forward when you have these safe spaces, whether they are in the thinking parts or the doing parts or the moving parts of your body. And I think that is the most important legacy of the JIUS. And I want to make one critical point about just the level of leadership that you're seeing here among my colleagues in Rio and Philadelphia, which is that very, very often when we talk about investing in sustainability, success is something that doesn't happen. This is the problem of sustainability, it's the problem of resilience. And very often, the greatest successes of cities are preventing something bad, where the community didn't flood because of the investment, or the disaster didn't turn into a major problem. And that's where I think cooperation like the JIUS can really make visible what's valuable to communities, even when that public action is typically invisible. And I think these kinds of cooperative chambers, whatever organizations they are incredibly important. And I would put a question back to Johanna to conclude the session on what the C40 sees as the potential of something like the JIUS that is moving on to a new phase.
Well, thank you for that question. So I was just going to say, to wrap up, so great minds think alike, but this is exactly why my organization, why C40 was created. It was created by cities, for cities, to help facilitate exchanges between cities where there are best practices to be shared and there are lessons to be shared. And we've seen so many examples of that between Rio and Philadelphia today. Rodrigo mentioned the Velib program, the bike sharing program in Paris that's taken off, and now we have bike sharing programs in 200 cities around the world. We see examples of this all the time, and there is that knowledge that exists at the local level. And so scaling it up is really why the organization exists, to help facilitate that. And so we're very excited to be partnering with JIUS and with all of the cities to be facilitating further exchanges like this. And I love the idea of expanding that into broader exchanges, private sector to private sector exchanges. You're starting to see some of this certainly between San Francisco and Beijing, for example, and we've seen it in other areas. But I'd love to see more of that. So thank you all for your participation. Please, I'd also like to thank very much the City of Rio for helping make this panel possible, and also the Rockefeller Foundation and the Brazilian Foundation for Sustainable Development that have helped to facilitate JIUS. And I'd like to, last but not least, thank all of our panelists for their comments today. Thank you.